What is up, guys? Dzeeff here, and we're back with another deck profile, which is pretty weird, but I teased this deck a little bit a week ago in the Remote Duel Invitational profile, and I got a lot of comments about it, so people seemed interested in seeing what an Altergeist Dogmatica deck could look like. This is a deck that I considered very early on for the tournament, the Remote Duel Invitational, but I dismissed it because I didn't really think it was good enough compared to the other decks. Looking back on it, I think this deck was better than I gave it credit for. I've been playing it pretty much for the last week online, and it's been going very well, actually. I do like this deck quite a lot. Obviously, it's Altergeist, so I'm always going to like it, but there are some advantages to playing the Dogmatica cards. It gives you 6 more starters, which is really cool, and Punishment is just a very strong generic trap card in any deck, but especially in one like this. There are some downsides. The main downside is that during the turn that you special summon Multifaker, you can only special summon Altergeist cards, which means that you can't Multifaker and Fleur-de-Lis on your opponent's turn, which kind of sucks. And also you can't do your big combo with Altergeist on your turn, like turn 2 or turn 3 or whatever, and then also special summon Ecclesia. That doesn't actually work. Besides that, though, I think this deck is very, very good. It does give you a lot more longevity than some other decks out there, and it's been doing pretty well online. It's been a lot of fun. I will say this particular version is kind of greedy because it's not really built for a tournament. It's just built for online play. I don't really care too much about losing game 1s for not having a lot of going second cards. I just want to make sure I win as many game 1s as possible when I go first. So if I was actually playing this in a tournament, I might play more hand traps in the main deck, but we'll kind of get to that as we go along here. So anyway, this deck is 41 cards. I couldn't think of a 1 card to cut, but let's take a look. So first off, we have 3 copies of Ecclesia and 1 copy of Fleur-de-Lis. Like I said, while this card is very good, it does conflict with Multifaker, and at the end of the day, this is primarily an Altergeist deck, not so much a Dogmatica deck. The Dogmatica cards are to support the Altergeist cards, not the other way around. So if you have Multifaker and you have this, you're always going to go for the Multifaker. That being said, you don't always open Multifaker, and you don't always open a way to get to it, so this card is still good to have just as a one of, and it's pretty good to search off the Ash Dragon, obviously. So the types of hands where you have this card or Nadir Servant, I'll kind of run through them. If you open Spoofing plus either of those cards, usually you'll just go for this as your normal summon and then spoofing back whatever Altergeist card you have in your hand to search the Multifaker. In that case, you have a Faker on your opponent's turn as well as a Punishment as an interruption. If you open like this card in Molseek or Silk, you can just summon a Link Kribo or a Salamangreat Almirage in the case of Silk, although I suppose you could summon Almirage from Molseek as well, but you don't usually want to. But you could just summon one of those monsters, get the Search in the case of Molseek for Faker, and then special this from your hand to search that Punishment once again. Notice I'm not really mentioning the Fleur-de-Lis too much. If your hand can get to Multifaker through Molseek or through Spoofing, you most likely are not even going to use this card in a match, but it is still a good option if you go first and don't draw any of the Altergeist cards, or especially if you don't draw any of the cards that search Multifaker specifically. Just in general, though, they're all pretty good. I mean, they're good for just keeping up tempo. The Dogmatica cards and the Altergeist cards all have a lot of +1 effects, which is really good for outgrinding your opponent. But that is it for the 4 main deck Dogmatica monsters. No Maximus. We don't need to try to do that win deck combo. There's no real reason to. For the Altergeist cards, we have 3 copies of Multifaker, of course, and 3 copies of Marionetter, 3 copies of Molseek, 2 copies of Silk, and 1 copy of Conqueree. We're not doing anything super fancy here. Yeah, having 3 Faker is particularly good because if you have the Ecclesia, you're usually going to normal summon that card because Punishment is just so strong, so you want to hard draw the Multifaker or draw the Spoofing and some other Altergeist card. Yeah, I think this is pretty standard. You do have more normal summons. You do add 3, but realistically, the Ecclesias usually are not normal summons because if you draw the Molseek or the Silk, then you can just special summon the Ecclesia from your hand. But yeah, I suppose you could have a higher potential for bricking. I don't really find that too much of an issue with this deck. If anything, I enjoy having more starter cards. Pretty much every single hand in this deck now has a monster card in it, which is really, really good, especially over the course of a lot of games. Like if you're just playing a bunch of games online, it's pretty good to always open at least a playable hand. The only monster hand trap that we're main decking seen is Effect Veiler, and yeah, Dragoon has popped up online a lot. It's really good to have something to stop the Anaconda besides just impermanence. Like I said, this build is a little bit greedier than I would normally play in an Altergeist deck in a tournament, because in tournaments I want to make sure that every hand, first or second, is going to be good enough to win. But when I'm just playing matches online, I don't care as much, so I'm fine just having the 5 main decked hand traps. But if you're playing this deck a little bit more seriously, if you're playing it in like a locals or something, maybe main decking more hand traps is the right way to go. We also have 3 copies of Pot of Extravagance. This does not conflict with the Dogmatica stuff at all. You don't really care about what you're sending too much. And also, even if you like banished all of the Dogmatica stuff in the extra deck, you can still like send Hexstia with the Nadir Servant if you want to search a Dogmatica Ecclesia, because it has 1500 attack points, so it doesn't really matter. But yeah, obviously Extravagance is too good to cut. And then 3 copies of the Nadir Servant, so just more starter cards. And yeah, this deck is I mean, like I said, every single hand is pretty much really playable because you have so many more starter cards now. We also have 3 copies of Spoofing, which is always a great card, but in this build in particular, you really want to open the Spoofing, because if you open the Ecclesia and you don't have Mulseek, the Spoofing is very important to actually find that multifaker on your opponent's turn. We also have 2 copies of Protocol and 1 copy of Manifestation, just the standard 6 Altergeist traps. I guess Spoofing is an Altergeist trap, but the standard 6 traps you've seen me play time and time again. We have 3 copies of Judgment and 3 copies of Strike, the Solemns here. One of the cards that you could cut if you want to build a deck that's better going second would be the Judgments. I've been seeing more and more Altergeist players cutting Judgment from the main deck because it is pretty much useless when you go second, but like I said, I'm just trying to build this deck as greedy as possible. I just want to go first and win the game. But if you're playing this deck and you want to be able to go second more, you want to find room for more hand traps, Judgment is cuttable from the main deck, which is kind of interesting. For the other trap cards, we have 3 copies of Impermanence. So we do have some going second cards. We do have 5 hand traps, and you have some other cards that can break boards. Not huge boards, but smaller boards. And yes, you do have some going second options there. And then 2 copies of Punishment. I actually did have 3 copies, but like I said, this deck is already 41 cards. So I suppose you could play 42 if you really wanted to. I mean, there are enough starters where you probably could get away with 42 cards, but then you have a lower chance of drawing your side deck cards and games 2 and 3, so I think 41 is fine. Maybe you could even cut 1 Ecclesia and have a perfect even 40, but 41 seems to be fine for me right now. For the extra deck here, we have 3 copies of Hexstia, of course, 2 copies of Prime Banshee. I know it seems silly, I know everyone thinks this card is trash, but I still think Prime Banshee is really good in most of the combos. I think people are still very underutilizing this card. I think it's actually a lot better than people give it credit for, and that's just in my experience playing Altergeist, which I have a little bit of experience playing it. 3 copies of Link Kribo and 2 copies of Almirage. You really need these cards in your extra deck for the Ecclesia, so that when you summon the Mulseek, you can always special summon the Ecclesia from your hand. That is hands down the best opening in this deck, Mulseek plus Nadir Servant or Ecclesia. So yeah, I think you really need to have these 5 in the extra deck just to make sure you can always do that play. For the cards that go with all of the Dogmatica stuff, we have 2 copies of Ash Dragon, 2 copies of Natis, and 1 copy of Pegasus. The Pegasus might look silly, but I actually feel like a lot of the time it is the best thing to send on turn 1. The problem with this card in a lot of decks is that you don't really have cards your opponent is killing, like through destruction, but in Altergeist, a lot of the times the way your opponent is forcing out your Silk Bounce or whatever is by attacking over it, and in that case you can just banish the Pegasus and then shuffle a card on the field back into your opponent's deck, which is really strong. Yeah, I mean, sending the Ash Dragon is fine. The only problem there is that when you use the Nadir Servant, you're adding the Ecclesia all the time. That's your really only target there. You're never going to add just the Fleur-de-Lis. So in that case, when you send the Ash Dragon, I mean, you can add the Fleur-de-Lis, but if you have the Multifaker, you're never going to be able to use it anyway. So a lot of the times I just send the Pegasus turn 1 and it turns out fine. I never ended up picking one up, but if you want to play the Fossil Warrior Skull Knight, that's also pretty good. And if you don't want to play the Pegasus, but I think Pegasus is pretty strong. You already have a lot of ways to destroy cards. It's kind of cool having a way to just like shuffle things back into the deck. So for the side deck here, and a couple of these cards are interchangeable with the main deck. I've gone through a lot of different builds, and a lot of these cards could work in the main deck just fine. So like the 3 copies of Ash Blossom could be in the main deck if you want them to, as could the 3 copies of Gamma and 1 copy of Driver. So when you go second against combo decks, you have plenty of ways to stop their opening combo with these cards and the other hand traps in the main deck. So games 2 and 3 go just fine. It's just that game 1 going second against combo is going to be rough in most situations. We also have 2 copies of Cosmic Cyclone because it's just really good in grindy matchups against Eldritch, which is all over the place right now. 3 copies of Rivalry of Warlords. The 2 archetypes that you're playing are all spellcasters. All the Dogmatica cards are spellcasters, all the Altergeist cards are spellcasters, so Rivalry is very, very good. I think this card is fantastic against all the decks that are using the Helki Fibrax and the Link Cross and all that stuff, because those monsters are all different types, which means that Rivalry can just kind of lock your opponent out of the game, and it's even not that bad going second because you can use this card to break boards, which is kind of funny. And then lastly, 3 copies of a Pointer of the Red Lotus. Luckily, I think most people are not playing evenly matched right now, so you don't have to worry about that too much, but obviously everyone is playing Lightning Storm. I mean, I'm not in this deck. I was at some point, but yeah, a Pointer is still really good for hitting that Lightning Storm, and obviously you also have the Solemn Judgment too, which is pretty solid. But yeah, that is the deck profile for this deck. Like I've said a couple times, this version of the deck is a little bit more greedy than I usually play with Altergeist, because I like to have decks that are good going first and second, and this one's a little bit more like going first focused. But overall, I've had a lot of fun playing this deck. Maybe I should have given it a second chance when I was testing for the Remote Duel Invitational. I'm still pretty sure that other decks are better than this one, but this deck is pretty good and a lot better than I initially gave it credit for. Anyway, I'll see you guys later. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Goodbye.